Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. I grew up in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and if I go back to my old hometown today, I find that much has changed. What used to be a 4-lane highway now is about 12 lanes of asphalt. Roads that were once relatively quiet and good shortcuts now are busy with development and other traffic. But the broad outlines that I understood are still valuable in helping me to find my way around, even if I can often find myself confused when it doesn't look quite like I expected it to. Geopolitically, I grew up during the Cold War. In this week's episode of Horns, Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and Hal Brands, Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, discuss Brands' new book, The Twilight Struggle: What the Cold War Teaches Us About Great Power Rivalry Today. Much like I can understand geographically a lot and feel familiar in my hometown even as it feels uncomfortable, Brands argues that there are elements we can draw from the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that help to illuminate, explain, and clarify aspects of the competition between the United States and China today. Equally important, as Brands and Inboden discuss, there are other aspects that are very different and will leave us in an unfamiliar neighborhood if we try to follow our old instincts. In this discussion, Brands and Inboden cover many of the important aspects, including nuclear strategy, grand strategy, and other aspects of organization and development, and the degree to which the United States security structure today rests upon a culture that grew up during the Cold War. This is a fascinating discussion and a book that I look forward to reading. Let's listen in.
Hello, I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at the University of Texas at Austin. Very honored to be hosting our latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma with a native of Austin, Texas, and a good friend of mine, Professor Hal Brands. Hal is a professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs, and also a fellow with the American Enterprise Institute, one of the most venerable and influential think tanks in Washington, D.C. He's the author of many excellent books. And I was saying earlier, this latest one that we're going to be talking about just released this month. The Twilight Struggle may be my favorite Hal Brands book yet. So Hal, looking forward to talking about the book. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Will. I appreciate the kind words, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great. So let's begin at the beginning, as it were. Where did you get the idea for doing this book? Like, tell us some of the intellectual origins of it, and then the process you went about of researching it.
Well, in a lot of ways, I guess this is a book that I've been thinking about writing for a number of years. And so, as you know, I was trained as a Cold War historian when I was in grad school 10 or 15 years ago. And so have really thought about the Cold War, its history, and some of its contemporary lessons for a long time. But I think what motivated me to do this book in particular was simply the fact that by 2018, 2019, when I was starting to conceptualize the book, it was pretty clear that we were moving into relatively intense and relatively enduring competitions of various sorts with China and Russia. Those competitions are not entirely the same, of course, but nonetheless, they're parallel in many ways. And so a lot of what I've tried to do throughout my career is basically ask questions about how history can inform our approach to present problems. And so since it seemed like these long-term geopolitical competitions were likely to be the most significant problems the United States faced in the coming years, I figured I might go back to the history of the Cold War and see what it could teach us about a new round of Twilight Struggles today.
Great. Well, and that brings up an obvious point. And of course, you and I share an interest in the policy applications of history to contemporary, strategy challenges. But it's always obligatory when we are looking for insights or lessons into the past to first remind ourselves of what some of the dissimilarities might be. Of course, most of our conversation today is going to be about similarities or lessons from the Cold War. But let's first, I think, for our listeners, put those out there and reassure them that you are aware that we're not in an identical moment as we were in 1946. So, what would be, I guess, some of the most important differences between the first Cold War and the moment we're in now?
There are major differences, as you allude to, and Xi Jinping's China is not the Soviet Union of Joseph Stalin. Vladimir Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union of Joseph Stalin. If you look at the U.S.-China competition in particular, the geography of that competition is vastly different than the geography of the US-Soviet competition was. There are ideological dimensions of both the US-Russia and US-China competitions, but they're different than the sort of the communism versus democracy / capitalism clash of the Cold War. And there are aspects of today's competitions that loom much larger than they might have in the US-Soviet Cold War. And so, for instance, the Soviet Union was never a sort of technological rival to the United States in the same way that China is today. Yes, there were areas of technology where the Soviet Union was quite advanced, intercontinental ballistic missiles, for instance, but sort of the breadth of the technological challenge that China poses is significantly greater than anything that the Soviet Union posed. And so the circumstances are different, the players are somewhat different. And so we shouldn't assume that everything is identical and that the same playbook will work in, say, the US-China competition that might have worked during the Cold War. But this is a critical point. The whole point of trying to learn from history is based on the idea that you can still learn useful lessons from a past that is never exactly like the present. And so the argument that I try to make is that you don't have to think that this is a simple replay of Cold War I to realize that Cold War I may still have useful insights in dealing with our predicament today.
Yeah, and that last point is really important, and I think our listeners will be sympathetic, and of course, I hope your readers will be sympathetic to that as well. And you spell that out a little more in your introduction. And for the record, a couple of other differences that you alluded to, but I do think it's worth bearing in mind is obviously the economic interdependence between the U.S. and China is just a whole nother different order of magnitude. The U.S. and Soviet Union barely had much in the way of economic relations, and we don't have a comparable Warsaw Pact of Chinese satellites today the way that the Soviets had with the Warsaw Pact. But it's almost like the more you probe into some of the relevant differences between the first Cold War and what we're in now, in my mind, and this is a good segue to your book, the more the similarities and the analogies and the comparisons are all the more apt. And so I guess, so there you walk through some of these in the introduction, but maybe for our readers, why don't you sketch out what you do think are some of the most important similarities, just as a matter of geopolitical analysis between then and now?
Well, I think there are probably three good arguments for studying the Cold War to gain leverage on contemporary problems. And the first is that the Cold War is sort of less unusual than we often think. And it was a manifestation of a much longer running phenomenon in human history, which is long-term, high-stakes competition between rival powers. Right? This is something that goes back as far as recorded history goes back. It has occurred many times throughout the modern era. And the US-Soviet rivalry during the late 20th century was one example of this, just as the US-Russia and US-China rivalries today are. And so if the Cold War can teach us something interesting about this larger phenomenon of long-term competition, then it's worth studying today. So that's the first reason. The second reason would be that there is exactly one case in American history of the United States gearing up for multi-decade competition with an authoritarian rival. And that, of course, is the Cold War, right? We don't have an infinite number of examples of this in our own history. And so if we want to know what the United States does well or does poorly in long-term competition, we really don't have much alternative other than looking at the Cold War. And then I think the third reason is that a lot of the things that we had to do from a competitive standpoint during the Cold War do have certain parallels today. And so in order to succeed in the Cold War, the United States had to rally a diverse and often fractious group of allies to deal with an authoritarian challenge. It had to think about how to craft a long-term strategy. It had to figure out how it would reconcile competition with occasional cooperation and diplomacy with the enemy. It had to think about a lot of challenges that have parallels today. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Cold War, even as we recognize that today isn't exactly like anything we've seen before.
Great. So tell us, piggybacking off that, tell us why you picked the title, The Twilight Struggle.
Well, so the Twilight Struggle, as you know, was a phrase really coined in the context of the Cold War by John F. Kennedy in 1961. And the metaphor was apt in a lot of ways, because twilight is neither day nor night. It's sort of the murky in between. Just as the Cold War was neither really war nor peace, right? And so it wasn't a hot war in the sense that the U.S. and the Soviet Union never came to blows, although there were certainly plenty of hot wars that were part of the Cold War, proxy wars, the U.S. wars in Vietnam and Korea, and so on and so forth. But the Cold War wasn't really peace as Americans understood it traditionally either. It required the United States to do things that it had never really done in peacetime before, like maintain a large standing military, maintain commitments to countries around the globe. And so it was something clearly in between war and peace. And I think that was what Kennedy was getting at and when he called the Cold War a long twilight struggle. And I think if you just look at the course of U.S.-Russian and U.S.-Chinese relations today, you can see similar things. I mean, fortunately, the United States is not in a hot war with Russia or China right now. That would be a catastrophic scenario. But there are certainly forms of conflict that are going on, whether it's the struggle for influence in the South China Sea, the Chinese coercion of Taiwan and the American response, the prospect of insecurity and major military action in Eastern Europe by Russia. And so we find ourselves back in sort of a similarly nebulous space today.
Yeah. And I think, to say up front, I think you're absolutely correct that the Cold War is really the only previous time in American history that we did have a similar long-term competition. But for our historian friends who are listening, I had to ask, did you think at all about sort of the U.S. competition with Great Britain in the 19th century as somewhat of an analogy? Obviously, very different, but that seemed to me maybe the only other time I could think of in our history when we had anything even approximating this.
Yeah, and my boss at AEI, Corey Shockey, has written the definitive book on this subject, Safe Passage, which really talks about the U.S.-British relationship from the early 19th century into the mid-20th century. I mean, I think that was different.
A terrific
for a variety.
book, by the way. For our listeners, if you buy only one book today, buy Hal Brand's Twilight Struggle. But if you have room for a second book, Corey Shockey's Safe Passage. Okay.
That's right. But I think there were some interesting differences there as well. And so one was that the U.S.-British competition was really more intermittent. It waxed and waned to a greater degree than the Cold War did. Second, there was sort of much less sort of deliberate American mobilization and strategy in that conflict than there was during the Cold War. That's not to say that strategic thinking was absent to any degree, but nonetheless, it was a less focused competition. And the other fact of the matter was that both countries, frankly, had more important issues to deal with for long stretches during that rivalry. And so the reason that the rivalry ultimately ends, of course, is that the Brits decide they've got much bigger fish to fry than dealing with the United States, which is sort of this, annoying colonial offspring in the Western Hemisphere when they have to deal with Germany and other threats that are closer to home. The United States was fighting a civil war at points during this, was really internally focused for long stretches of the late 19th century. And so there are definitely elements of rivalry that are very important in shaping that relationship and shaping the international system, but it's not quite the same thing. And then, of course, the final element is that there was not, by the late 19th century, at least, there was not the same degree of ideological cleavage between the US and the UK that there was between the US and the Soviet Union. There was once a profound ideological cleavage, of course. The United States broke. That's right. But by the time you get to the 1890s and the early 20th century, in some ways, the political systems of the two countries are converging in a way that when the British have to decide which rivals to appease and which ones to resist, one of the reasons they choose to appease the Americans, sort of in the positive sense of the term, is they think that they can do much better in a world with a powerful America than they can in a world with a powerful Germany, for instance.
Yeah. So, great. Well, thanks for that little digression into 19th century history. Like I said, it's catnip for our historian listeners. Right. But back to the 20th century and the 21st century. I will say another thing I appreciate about your book is you're very clear that you are addressing it both for America's current, emerging competition with China and with Russia. And I think, we don't want to be too headline driven here. as this podcast is being recorded, there's a lot of concerns about looming Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it bears remembering that over the last several years, both with the Trump administration and the Biden administration, as they were coming to office, China really was the first priority. I mean, Russia, not quite an afterthought for the other two, but was very much second tier. And there's some justifiable reasons for that. However, as we're now seeing with current geopolitical tensions and perhaps even a looming hot war between Russia and Ukraine, Russia is very much a part of this competition as well. And you even have a wonderful turn of phrase on page 6 of your book. You refer to Russia and China as a new authoritarian international, of course, kind of a self-conscious echoing of the Communist International from 100 years ago. Tell us why, as a matter of your analysis, why you put Russia so much in the foreground of this, almost equal part with China.
It's interesting. I mean, when I started working on this book, and this is a reflection of how easily we as a country have kind of lost sight of the Russian challenge and the focus on the Chinese, the understandable focus on the Chinese challenge in recent years. The number one question I got was, why are you even including Russia as one of these competitors? They're not in the same league as China, and so on and so forth. You get sort of a different response today. But I think there is a good point in this, which is that if you worry about, if the question is like, which country is most likely to fundamentally change the international system in ways that the United States cannot accept, it's clearly China. I mean, China is mounting a much broader challenge to American influence. It's comprehensive in a lot of ways. It cuts across military issues, diplomatic issues, economic issues, technological issues, and so on. And so I think that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, is right in saying that China is the big one. And if we get one thing right, we've got to get China right. But Putin has this wonderful ability to remind us that we face two great power authoritarian rivals, not one. And whenever we forget that, he doesn't let us forget it for long. And so the Russian challenge is obviously narrower. I worry a lot less about the emergence of a Russo-centric world order than I do about the emergence of a Sino-centric world order. But Russia has lots of capability to disrupt the post-Cold War settlement in Europe, to project power into regions like the Middle East and Africa, to act as a foil for the United States globally, and basically to create a much more disordered, chaotic international system than we would like to face. And so I think the situation that we find ourselves in right now is that we're really facing parallel competitions with two authoritarian great power rivals. And those rivals are not formally allied, although they've become much closer than I think a lot of Western observers expected even a decade ago. Yeah. But they do work together in some interesting ways, and they certainly benefit from the fact that the other one causes problems for the United States. I think Putin has clearly benefited from the fact that the United States has been trying so hard to focus on China over the past 4 or 5 years. And I think China will reap reciprocal benefits if there's a major crisis of European security and the United States has to double down on its commitment to that continent.
Yeah. No, it bears noting just what a fairly unique moment this is geopolitically, with those that deepening cooperation across so many levels between Russia and China. I mean, not to be telling old war stories, but some 15 years ago when I was on the NSC staff and Peter Fever and I were doing the strategic planning work, one of the big studies we did was this question of, will there be an emerging Russian-Chinese condominium? And most of the analysis came back, very, very unlikely to happen for, historic and geopolitical reasons, so on and so forth. There were some dissenting voices, and some factors have pointed this could well happen, but it clearly has happened now. And it, again, for our younger listeners, it bears recalling, I'd say that, Russian-Chinese cooperation is probably its closest now as it's been in 70 years. Probably you probably have to go back to the 1950s. Really, would that be similar to your understanding?
I think there are a lot of parallels to the situation that we faced in the 1950s. And so, you guys were in good company back when you looked at this back in 2006, 2007, because I don't think there were a lot of Western observers who anticipated just how close the relationship was going to become. And there are some pretty powerful drivers of that relationship. Both countries obviously feel very uncomfortable in an international system led by the United States and its allies, and would like to see some pretty major changes. in that system. And so there are still long-term frictions in the relationship. And I feel fairly confident in saying that the Russo-Chinese partnership isn't going to last forever. I think they'll find it difficult to deal with each other over time. But here's the parallel to the 1950s. We thought the same thing about the Sino-Soviet Pact from the day that it was signed, that these two countries would have trouble getting along forever. But I think, people like John Foster Dulles understood that it might be 20 years before these differences really worked their way to the surface, which in fact, it was about 20 years. And so I think we find ourselves in a position where it's fashionable to say, could we somehow, peel the Russians away from the Chinese and use them as a tool of containment against the Chinese? I think the answer to that is no, not anytime soon. And so the reality is that we're going to be stuck with these parallel competitions for as long as the Putin regime lasts at the very least. And so while we should think about, a new form of triangular diplomacy, that's probably at least a decade in the future right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that an important cautionary note for any would-be statesmen or stateswomen out there with your Nixon and China fantasies of doing your version to Moscow, we may be 20 years away from that, right? The formal Sino-Soviet split had to happen in 1969 before Nixon and Kissinger could do their opening a few years later. All right, Hal, getting into some of the nuts and bolts of your book itself. I love how it's organized around kind of 10 themes from the Cold War, and I won't bother reading all of those. Readers, listeners, you'll want to buy the book and read those yourselves. But you pick 10 different themes, and first walk through the relevant Cold War history, and then draw out what some of those applications might be today. How did you go about selecting those particular themes, and would there be a couple of them you might want to highlight for our listeners that you found especially intriguing or maybe underappreciated?
Well, what I tried to do was to think of the competitive problems or the competitive challenges that the United States had to solve during the Cold War, and then asked if there were relevant parallels in the U.S.-China and U.S.-Russia competitions today. And so I ended up sort of the meaty part of that Venn diagram, ended up with about 10 issues, and those are the ones that really play an important role in the book. I mean, I think you could flag a handful of them. The one that's getting a lot of attention today is this question of sort of shaping a strategy or shaping a theory of victory in these competitions. And so it's probably worth talking more about China than Russia in this context. And the place we find ourselves in today is that we've had two consecutive administrations that have said that we need to gear up for competition with China without really explaining what that competition is meant to accomplish over the long run, or how we think it leads to a better world or a better peace in the long term. And I think there are understandable reasons for that, because I think there are actually some interesting analytical debates about it. And so, we haven't quite had that moment of clarity that we had in 1946, 1947 with Kennan's long telegram and X article, where he makes the argument, which is very quickly accepted, that this competition is rooted in the nature of the Soviet regime and will persist as long as the regime persists in its current form. I think today there's a little bit of a difference of opinion between folks who think something similar about the Chinese Communist Party and those who hope that sort of sharper competition now could lead to some form of managed coexistence over the long term. And so that analytical issue, I don't think, has quite been resolved. Although, to be fair, I think you're seeing more and more work suggesting that the Chinese challenge really actually is rooted to some important degree in the nature of the Chinese Communist Party. And it will be hard for the United States to have constructive relations with a powerful China that is led by that regime forever. Which is not, of course, an argument in favor of regime change. It's just sort of an argument in favor of what I've called elsewhere regime realism, sort of having a realistic view of what sort of relations you're likely to have with a China led by the CCP. But of course, the other reason that it's been hard to resolve this issue is that it's just a very sensitive question, right? And so the United States is trying to rally countries into a counterbalancing coalition. Some of those countries are ambivalent about the effort, and so going and saying, well, understand that this is going to last as long as the CCP does, may seem like a big ask at the moment. And so I think that's an area where history is relevant, because it's an area where we really don't have the same clarity now that we did, say, in the 1950s.
Yeah. Well, and on that, there were a couple of takeaways I highlighted from that chapter on the initial development of the containment doctrine. Called Forging a Strategy. Of course, the first one, which and you very clearly were building on the great work of our respective dissertation advisor John Gaddis at Yale on how containment was even the first few years of it. It wasn't like Kennan descends from the mountain of statesmanship with this oracular pronouncement of here is the doctrine, but rather he puts it out there. But then there's evolution, there's improvisation, there's some experimentation, there's reacting to events, whether it's the Berlin airlift or the Soviet nuclear test or the Korean invasion. And another one, a quote I want to read from your book, which again really jumped out at me, is while Kennan initially was obviously trying to identify the geographic priorities and acknowledge the trade-offs and cost, and managing risk, very fundamental principles of strategy. We also had to revise some geographically, such as realizing, it's a mistake to put, the Korean Peninsula outside of our defensive perimeter. And you have this quote: "The post-war world was stubbornly indivisible," meaning that even though the United States may have wanted to allocate resources in one part and correspondingly less in another, sometimes events in that other just have a way of dragging you back in and implicating events in the priority area. And again, thinking about connections today, while the Biden administration has understandably wanted to devote, so many more resources to the Indo-Pacific and to China, ongoing nuclear concerns with Iran, or certainly what's going on in Russia right now, are reminding them, as all of us, I don't mean to sound critical of the team in power, again, of this insight you have: the post-war world was stubbornly indivisible. So can you elaborate, I guess, on either or both of those points, both the kind of improvisation and evolution of containment, or the interconnectedness of events in one part of the world implicating ones that might be in your bigger priority theater?
Yeah, I mean, it's appropriate that you mentioned John Gaddis, who's obviously a great mentor to both of us, and I have a big intellectual debt to him. But I was joking to him that writing this book made me feel like a PhD student again, which was occasionally fun until I have nightmares about John angrily marking up the drafts of my dissertation chapters and things like that. So it was a little bit of a blast from the past.
Yeah.
But I
think all have those psychological scars. Yeah.
That's right. So. The point you make about the evolution of containment is really important, right? And so we make two mistakes when we think back about containment. One is thinking that it was etched in stone from the moment that Kennan wrote his X article, and that's not true. It evolved continually over the course of the Cold War, sometimes within a given presidential administration. And so, in some ways, the beauty of the theory was that it was very parsimonious, but it left a lot of room for adaptation over time. The second mistake that we make is in thinking that containment was sort of a consensus strategy in the United States. It was not. I mean, it was usually reluctantly embraced by a new presidential administration when it took power. That was certainly the case with the transition from Truman to Eisenhower. For instance, and it was subject to withering criticism from the left and the right, from hawks and doves, really throughout the Cold War. And that was baked into the nature of the strategy. It was slow, it was incremental, it was frustrating. It often felt like we were continually on the defensive. And it's one of these strategies that sort of looks like it's failing up until the point when it succeeds beyond anybody, except maybe Kennan's, wildest expectations. And so that I think that's a useful piece of historical perspective to keep in mind. The last thing you raised, which I'll just talk about very briefly, was sort of interconnectedness. And I think Kennan initially had a very tailored conception of what containment meant. It was Western Europe and Japan and not a whole lot else, right? And then it becomes clear that Western Europe needs Middle Eastern oil. Japan needs markets and resources in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And then once the Korean War breaks out, it looks like American positions are endangered everywhere. And so you get a transition to sort of a much more globalized version of containment. And you can see some similar challenges today. It's fine to say that we should do less in the Middle East to focus on China, but China itself is looking to establish greater influence in the Middle East. And having a strong position in the Middle East might give us leverage vis-a-vis China in a crisis or a conflict. And so what we find today, and again, this is not a critique of policymakers or strategists, it's just sort of a nasty reality of the world, is that it's harder to focus on just one thing than we might like it to be.
Yeah, no, or even building on that, and this was both applicable in the Cold War, but also today. Some of our key allies in our balancing coalition or free world coalition, whatever you want to call it, are going to be reliant on Middle Eastern oil. So today it would be India and Japan, right? So the United States is no longer so reliant on hydrocarbons from the Middle East, but two of our key Pacific allies are. So having some sort of American presence there may be the price of admission, if you will. So. Hal, another chapter I found really fascinating, but want to come at it from a different angle is competing in the nuclear shadow, right? This is your one on essentially the role of nuclear weapons in the Cold War. And I'll say that this one was what I found one of the most interesting chapters to read as a matter of history. I mean, for, again, our listeners, if you want to find one chapter in any book to do a great summary of the complexities of nuclear doctrine of the Cold War, this would be it. However, and I don't mean to sound too critical here, this was also the one where it was a little harder for me to see the clear takeaways for our current moment as far as the role of nuclear doctrine and strategic forces in the current great power competition. And I just would love to hear your reflections on that.
Yeah, and this is a case actually where I think the subject matter has probably gotten more relevant since I started writing the book about 2 years ago. And so, one thing that was often raised, I think, when I initially proposed this was that there's simply no parallel to the Cold War arms race and the US-China competition. Now, the more Chinese missile fields that pop up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the more we may have to revise that view. And it does appear that China is pushing to become something like a nuclear peer of the United States within a decade or so. And so the Cold War parallels are perhaps getting a little bit uncomfortable at the moment. But I think, there's kind of one or two big takeaways from that chapter, even as we acknowledge that issues of nuclear deterrence and conventional warfighting are different today than they were during the Cold War. But I think that the basic tension kind of remains. And so the basic tension that U.S. policymakers faced during the Cold War was this trade-off between strategic stability and strategic advantage. And so sort of the mutual assured destruction school was based on the idea, which is entirely reasonable, that nothing would be worse than a nuclear war. And so you needed to strive for maximum stability in the nuclear arms race between the superpowers, arms control agreements, not investing in lots of first strike capabilities and things like that. The problem, of course, was that America's entire Cold War strategy rested on the threat of using nuclear weapons first in a war in order to avoid losing at the conventional level. And you can't credibly threaten to use nuclear weapons first unless you have some degree of dominance at the higher end of the escalation ladder. And so American strategy actually required us to pursue a certain instability to make the Soviets fear that they would come out really badly in a nuclear exchange. Now, we're not dealing with something entirely similar today, but in fact, the same basic tension is there. And so if the United States is committed to the defense of Taiwan, and there's a debate around that, it's not entirely impossible that we might find ourselves in a situation where an American president is presented with the choice of, do you want to use limited nuclear strikes or lose Taiwan to a Chinese assault? And so sort of some of these same questions are coming back to the surface. We see them in Europe as well, where we worry a lot about limited Russian nuclear strikes or even demonstrative strikes as a way of sort of bringing a local conflict to a conclusion on their terms. And so these old issues are going to become more and more relevant over time, even as the circumstances change.
So terrific. All right. Well, another chapter, and again, we can't highlight all of them here, but as we're jumping around and highlighting the ones I think might be of most interest to our listeners, was Organizing for Victory. Again, this is a wonderful summary of both the really big interagency structural changes that took place, creating the National Security Council, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense with the 1947 National Security Act. But also you highlight some of these smaller, almost boutique offices, policy planning at state, Office of Net Assessment over at the Pentagon, that play outsized influential roles in helping generate creative ideas or challenging the conventional wisdom in the Cold War. Again, what were some of your big takeaways from this chapter on the U.S. government institutions, big and small, that were necessary to prevail?
I think the big one is that we often forget just how much the U.S. government was shaped by the Cold War. And so when we sort of, look at the national security state today, that is a framework that was, first developed primarily in response to World War II, but then really comes of age during the Cold War. And so if you think about sort of the key agencies and departments that make up the National Security Council, if you think about the emergence of the National Security Council and the CIA and the Joint Chiefs of Staff as statutory bodies, all those things happen in the context of the Cold War. And the idea is that if the United States is going to be involved in global geopolitics on a regular basis, it needs a more structured way of organizing itself and making decisions in that context. And so the exact layout of the U.S. government has obviously changed over time, but what we have today is still the framework that was created in 1947 at the outset of the Cold War. The second thing is that the sorts of governmental capabilities that you need shift over time. And so it's interesting. So that the main pillars of the U.S. national security establishment really remain the same over the course of the Cold War: Department of Defense, the intelligence community, the State Department, and things of that nature. But sort of the second tier players shift a lot. And so you get agencies and departments that emerge in response to specific challenges, right? So the U.S. Information Agency comes about to help the United States win, the struggle for informational influence, particularly in the Third World. The U.S. Agency for International Development and the Peace Corps come about in the 1960s as part of an intensifying struggle for influence in the developing regions. You get the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. You get things like the Active Measures Working Group in the 1980s. And so these sort of, purpose-specific bodies or organizations, sometimes they're just kind of cross-departmental working groups, actually play a really important role in keeping the U.S. government up to speed with what's happening in the world. And so the challenges that we face today vis-a-vis China or Russia, in some ways are the same, in some ways they're different, right? We have an active measures problem. Once again, if you look at all of the disinformation, there are challenges related to technology and export controls and things like that. And so we're probably going to need a similar updating of the U.S. national security infrastructure over time.
Yeah. Well, I've got to ask, just as a follow-up, since this is an idea being kicked around in some of the think tank circles today. Given the new salience of political warfare, of the battle of ideas, of countering Russian and Chinese disinformation, do you think we need to recreate a USIA for the 21st century?
So I don't know if I have enough confidence to say that it needs to be a new USIA per se. I mean, I do think that what we've learned a couple of things over the past few years. And so one is that the U.S. government does struggle to pull together information and responses to information challenges across the various elements of the U.S. government. And that of course, was a role that USIA was initially created to play. How well it did kind of varied over time. And I think we've also certainly learned that our existing infrastructure in the informational realm really isn't working as we might hope. And so there's going to need to be some greater centralization of authority and response in the U.S. government when we're dealing with informational matters, if only as a way of kind of aggregating the insight and capabilities that a lot of different actors within the U.S. government can bring to bear. Whether it's going to look exactly like the USIA or something different, or whether it might be housed within an existing agency this time. I mean, those are sort of tactical questions, but I think on the whole, this is a really good example of an area where our governmental infrastructure is underdeveloped right now.
Yeah, and you made a great point that USIA was so successful that it worked itself into obsolescence, right? So when the earlier battle of ideas in the Cold War. Back to the institutional question again. I loved how you highlighted the Office of Net Assessment, and of course, an office you've done some direct work with before, and particularly the work of the late great Andy Marshall and his competitive strategies framework. And you go quite a bit in a couple of chapters highlighting how, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, the United States realize that it's not just that we want to outspend the Soviets, but we want to outthink, outsmart them with leveraging our technological advantages to have our next generation of weapons systems and platforms that will eclipse anything they have. And you're very clear that this was done in a asymmetric way to really impose costs on the Soviets, so that no matter how many more tanks they may build, our tank killers, which are less expensive, are more potent and lethal. Or certainly that our terrain hugging V1 or stealth V2 could penetrate their air defense systems, no matter how much money they threw at surface air missiles or radars and so on and so forth. And obviously, I'm a sucker for that because that's one of the themes of my forthcoming book on Reagan's foreign policy. But we're not here to talk about that. We're talking about your book. Here's my question, though. You make a couple references to now how China has essentially taken a page from that playbook, is turning that strategy on us. And I think you're right. And then a number of our friends in the Pentagon are working very hard on this problem. Is there still room for the United States to return to some of our comparative advantages in a competitive strategies framework to turn that back on China and Russia in the military balance?
I think there is. And I think the point that you make is a really good one, in the sense that if China in particular and Russia to a lesser degree have really played the asymmetric cost imposition game better than we have over the past couple decades. And you see this particularly in China's case with the anti-access area denial capabilities. And so the relatively cheap capabilities, anti-ship missiles and that sort of thing, that can pose a really significant threat to an American way of war that depends very heavily on big forward bases, big platforms like aircraft carriers, things that you don't have a lot of, and it really costs you a lot if they're put out of commission. And so when we think about the challenges that the United States would face in trying to, say, defend Taiwan or defend Japan, being on the wrong side of the cost curve, so to speak, as a result of these A2AD capabilities is really at the top of the list. I think the good news, though, is that there's lots of scope for the United States to basically turn China's game against it in this respect. And so, what China has to do to establish primacy in the Western Pacific is to project a lot of power over a lot of water, and that has always been a difficult task. It's a sort of warfare that's probably biased toward the defense. And so I think that the United States, Japan, Taiwan have an opportunity to basically turn China's strategy against it by investing in lots of capabilities that can just make it too difficult to project a lot of power. And so if I were Taiwan, right, I would be stocking up on anti-ship missiles, sea mines, ground-based long-range fires, things that can basically, to be kind of graphic about it, turn the Taiwan Strait into a death trap for any Chinese invasion fleet. You can see the Japanese doing similar things, by the way, placing missile launchers on some of their small southernmost islands that are strategically situated near Taiwan, and basically trying to confront the Chinese with the challenge that if they attack, that they're going to suffer really severe attrition at the hands of capabilities that it doesn't cost the U.S. and its allies a ton to develop and field.
Yeah. Okay. Terrific. All right. So some signs of hope there. So, and again, good lessons from the Cold War. Hal, we'll do two final questions. All right. The first one is, while I hope that as many of our friends in the Biden administration as possible will be able to buy and read your book, you and I know as former policymakers that it's hard to find time to actually read books. And so hopefully at least a few of our currently serving national security leaders will be able to listen to this podcast, maybe during their morning workouts, their commute into work. So if you could impress upon the senior leadership of the Biden administration one or two of the most important top-line takeaways from your book or their current challenges, what would those be?
I think one is just the importance of thinking about negotiation as a tool of competition rather than as an alternative to it. And so, we sometimes think that negotiation or arms control, whatever, is kind of peacenik stuff. It's really not. When done well during the Cold War, the United States was pretty frequently involved in negotiations of one type or another with the Soviet Union, because those negotiations could play a variety of important roles. They could tamp down tensions at the margin. They could give the United States a strategic breather when it was exhausted after the Vietnam War. For instance, they could even shift the competition into areas more favorable to the United States. So one of the great virtues of the arms control agreements of the early 70s, for instance, is that the SALT I Accord basically ends the vertical arms race. It ends the numeric arms race, which means that the quality of your weapons becomes more important. And that's an area that favored the United States. What negotiation can't really do usually is just transform the nature of a competitive relationship. And so I think that's something that's quite relevant vis-a-vis China today. There are areas where we would like to have China's cooperation, pandemic surveillance and response, climate change diplomacy, and things of that nature. We can debate how realistic some of those wants are. But what we need to see that is sort of part of a larger strategy of competition and not a replacement for it, and not something where we should make sort of unrelated geopolitical concessions to get China's cooperation on transnational issues that really concern us. And so I think that's one issue that seems particularly salient today.
Yeah. Okay. Well, terrific. Yeah, I'm in strong agreement there. All right. The final question. This is more of a just one as far as an intellectual musing, not to make light of the current moment, but as we really try to take the longer view here. And by way of preface, this week in my graduate seminar at the LBJ School here at UT Austin, I'm teaching on World War I and II, and the students are reading Neil Ferguson's classic book, War of the World. And, the basic argument is a very complex, fascinating book. The basic argument is to treat World Wars I and II as really one prolonged, 50-year European conflict with a 20-year or so hiatus or ceasefire, between the end of hostilities in World War I and World War II. He really treats it, very persuasively to my mind, as one long conflict. Here's my question for you: 100 years from now, when historians are looking back on the time that we're in now, do you think they might look and see one long, almost century-long Cold War twilight struggle, which started in roughly 1945 or 50, and maybe continues into 2045 or 2050? And there was just kind of that 1990 to 2010 or so ceasefire or hiatus or holiday from history, whatever you want to call it. In other words, is your book actually about the same long-term struggle we've been in since the end of World War II?
I mean, I think we're certainly going to look back on the post-Cold War period as the aberration rather than the norm. And we are going to look back on it as kind of a holiday from great power competition. In some ways, you could actually, and this, by the way, is the subject of the book I'm working on now, extend the time period even farther back, really to the beginning of the 20th century. And there are some continuities that run through all of the great power competitions that have happened since then. And I think you can make, a fairly persuasive argument that what's happening between the US and Russia today is, in the eyes of some Russian strategists, I think, just sort of a continuation of the Cold War struggle. And so, the Soviet Union got knocked down. It had to drop out for a little while. And now it's contesting some of the concessions that it had to make when it was very weak. And so there's a degree of continuity there. I mean, I think it's a great question, because intelligent people can argue about where the similarities end and where sort of the linkages do and do not extend. But certainly we're looking at a pattern of ongoing competition between democratic and authoritarian great powers, and that is a theme of continuity stretching back to the beginning of the Cold War and even before.
Terrific. All right. Well, I hope our listeners picked up that you alluded to a new book that you're working on, and we won't go into that too much right now, but I'm excited about the topic, and I know we'll be able to have you back on the show for that one once that comes out. All right. We'll wrap it up. Again, this has been a wonderful discussion with Professor Hal Brands of the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS and the American Enterprise Institute on his excellent new book, just released this month, The Twilight Struggle: What the Cold War Teaches Us About Great Power Rivalry Today. So, Hal, thank you again so much.
Thanks, Will. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.